I'm going to chat to Karen in a minute, save the best for a little while, and maybe we'll start with our first slide. Those of us who work in the NHS, those of us of a certain age have made the decision, but most of us are going to face it in the coming months. You know, over 17 million people in the UK have received their first dose, and we've just learned that the government's intention is that all adults will be offered it by the end of July. And so the purpose of this evening is just to think about how we're going to answer the question for ourselves. So if you're anything like me, you will look at graphs that look a little bit like this on most days. And the numbers are pretty stark. Over 120,000 people in the UK have died. Yesterday, 445 more deaths recorded, and today 215. And we are one of the worst affected nations in the world. And even though our current infections are thankfully reducing, we are still amongst the highest rates, currently speaking. And over the horizon on a white horse comes the idea of vaccination. And vaccinating the population is held out as a solution to the pandemic, an end to lockdown, a return to normal, hope for the holidays, free by summer are two of the headlines in today's newspapers. And the data from Israel, which is the nation in the world furthest ahead with vaccination, is positive. We'll soon be able to go back to the currently empty shopping mall. We hear of the negative impacts of lockdown, and we want to move on. So in our first section, I'm just going to try and cover two areas, one of them biblical and one of them biological. The biblical first, and that's to say this, that the pandemic matters because people are valuable to God. The verses on the screen now from Psalm 139, we're not arrangements of molecules only, we're made by a creator. Think of a beginner violin, something you may purchase for 50 or 60 pounds, and in the hands of a non-beginner, it sounds pretty good. Think of a Stradivarius. They can be priced in the millions. Why? Because of who made it. Well, you haven't been made by a great human craftsman, but by the God who spoke the universe into existence. His works are wonderful. People are valuable to God. And that's why the pandemic should bother us. We could have turned to so many different places in Scripture to make the same point. We've just been looking at Genesis 2 as a church. We're valuable because we're made in his image. We could have turned to the end of the book of Jonah, where the prophet is rebuked because God is concerned about the people of Nineveh and Jonah is not. People are valuable to God, and that is why the pandemic ought to concern us. Above the impact on the economy, above the annoyance of not being able to see family or go to the places we like to go to or do the sports we'd like to do, this is a disease that kills people, and people are valuable to God. We can see Christians in history being driven by this motivation of care for people. Think of Elizabeth Fry, who worked to improve prison conditions, who campaigned to abolish the death penalty for trivial crimes. She did that because she had a biblical view of the value of people. Martin Luther stayed in town to continue his ministry when the plague arrived. Why? Because he had a biblical view of the value of human beings, and we cannot be unmoved by the current pandemic. When we look at the hope the vaccine holds out, we might see it as a shallow hope. We should be moved to share the gospel, because my great hope shouldn't be unfettered shopping until I die, or the hope of a holiday that for the Christian is only a foreshadowing of my eternal rest. If my friends go back to normal, they are still heading towards judgment and an eternity without Christ. And so I cannot be unmoved by the thought of the death of many. That's the biblical point. The pandemic matters because people are valuable to God. Okay, now for the biology, I just thought it might be helpful to think a little bit about how immune system works. If you're taking notes, I've stopped now. This slide takes about 2 lessons to teach to my A-level classes. If you haven't got a GCSE in biology, apologies, I hope it makes sense. If you've got more than an A-level, apologies, I know it's a simplification. But our immune system is amazing. We are wonderfully made. And I am thankful that in my day job, I get to be reminded of this quite frequently. So your immune system, if you kind of look in the middle of the picture, there's a bacteria arriving. Oh dear, could be a virus, could be a different pathogen, and it'll be ingested by a type of white blood cell called a macrophage. The macrophage presents bits of the virus or bacteria on its surface, described as the antigen. And somewhere in your body, there is a T helper cell that will recognize that antigen. They'll bind to each other. The T helper cell will begin to divide and produce a clone of T helper cells. And they are needed to activate the 2 key parts of the immune system. Look over on the left of the diagram. We've got a B cell that will recognize the same antigen. It will ingest it. It will hold it on its membrane. And when it comes into contact with one of the cloned T helper cells, the B cell will be stimulated to divide. And it will divide into many thousands of cells, which then differentiate and begin to produce antibodies. The antibodies will then bind to that specific antigen, whether it's the spike protein on coronavirus or whatever else has been presented in the immune system. The antibodies bind to viruses or bacteria and they prevent them infecting cells. And so virus particles loose in the blood are destroyed. Meanwhile, over on the right-hand side of the diagram, there's a third class of white blood cell called the T killer cell. The T killer cell is able to recognize body cells of yours that are infected. The right T killer cell is activated to divide by the T helper cell, and then cells in your body that are infected with the virus are recognized and destroyed by the T killer cells. That's why in the press reports and so on, you have lots of people talking about T cells being just as important as antibodies. Well, they're both important. It's like a pincer movement. That's kind of how your immune system works. Notice one last thing before we move on. When T helper cells divide, they make some memory cells. When B cells divide, they make some memory cells. When T killer cells divide, they make some memory cells. That means if you meet the same pathogen again, your body is able to respond to it much more quickly. Let's have a look at the next graph. It's quite exciting if you like biology. So in the first infection, there's a little time delay whilst the immune system gears up and begins producing antibodies. And the number of antibodies you produce is not so many. Whereas the second time you meet the same antigen, you can see the immune response is much more rapid. There's no time gap. And you produce far more antibodies. So your immune system is better able to respond and deal with that antigen. And that's why there's debate in the news about when you get your first dose of the vaccine, when you get your second dose of the vaccine, how long you ought to wait before you consider that some of your immune response is ready to fight it. So don't have the jab and go and lick random strangers the next day. It's a couple of weeks before really your immune system is going. And it's good to have the booster because that means your immune system is better prepared. So that's how vaccines tend to work. Let's look at the next slide. And instead of meeting the real thing, the vaccine introduces just the antigen or the means of making it into your body. That then triggers a complex immune response, antibodies, T cells, memory cells. When you are exposed to the real thing, you're able to combat the virus without becoming ill or without passing it on. Now, again, there's debate in the news about if you can stop being ill and then not pass it on and how many people have stopped doing it. All those kind of things are really how effective is the vaccine at triggering your immune response. But here's the biological point. Even if we don't understand any of the biology, we can be thankful for common grace. That is God's working in the world. That means scientists can make vaccines and we can receive them. So that's part one. The pandemic is significant because people are valuable to God, and we can be thankful for common grace, which means that scientists can make vaccines and we can receive them. Now we're going to, very exciting, talk to, oh no, sorry, one last thing about conspiracy theories, and then we'll talk to Karen. Well, I won't go into detail. You've listened to Orlando this morning, so we're able to avoid conspiracy theories surrounding the vaccine. They range from the unfounded ridiculous, like Bill Gates is microchipping me, to the legitimate but underinformed. You know, it's happened too fast, it's not been tested, I don't know if it's effective. And I think that's partly because of vaccine history. So the first vaccine that was developed against smallpox, the initial trial for that vaccine in 1796 was done on a 9-year-old boy called James Phipps. Well, that's a sample size of 1 compared to the tens of thousands involved in current vaccine trials. James was aged 9, no real record of informed consent that he even knew what Edward Jenner was doing to him. Even in the last century, the polio vaccine, which is the first vaccine that has been used to successfully eradicate a disease from the world, was tested in some ways that we wouldn't be happy with. For example, on the children in a residential care home for those with special needs, without their knowledge or consent. Polio vaccine was rushed into production. One batch was not done properly, and thousands of children were unfortunately injected with live virus. But for the current corona vaccine viruses approved in the UK, none of these concerns are real concerns. Any medical procedure, of course, has risk and potential side effects, but we can take the vaccine with confidence. You know, we should be rightly critical of some of the government's decision-making, but investment and therefore acceleration of vaccine development is not one of them. We can be thankful for common grace, which means scientists can make vaccines and we can receive them. So no conspiracy theories here, I think. Anyway, now we're going to pause and we're going to talk to Karen. We're just going to ask her 3 questions. Now, Karen, again, a lot of people won't necessarily know you, although if they're a student, they'll have eaten some of your lunches, I'm sure. And if they're looking at you on screen, they'll be thinking, well, Karen doesn't qualify on age grounds to have received the vaccine. But just tell us, have you had the vaccine and why?
I have had the vaccine because I'm a practice nurse and I've been giving the vaccine.
So just tell us, are you happy to both receive and give the vaccine?
I am, but I had to think it through. So way back earlier in the autumn, so just like everybody else, I'd been following what had been happening with vaccine development, and obviously we were all quite hopeful that there might be a vaccine. And then in early autumn, I give children vaccines as part of my job, and it's the part of my job that I really love. So I'm very, very pro-vaccination. I had to phone a mother who was declining vaccines, and she had all kinds of reasons. But one of her reasons was that she said that there were fetal cells in the vaccines. And I thought, you're completely mad. That's what I thought in my head. And I was Googling and discovered that actually there are vaccines that no vaccine has any fetal cells in, just to get that straight. But that cell lines have been used for the MMR vaccine, because that's what we were talking about. But I then discovered that actually that was the case for the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca had involvement with that. And that really actually made me quite conflicted, because obviously, because partly it's a big part of my job, and partly because I was really, want a vaccine to be successful. So I had to think it through and had to think, you know, actually, because I weighing lots of things up about, well, actually, the vaccination would save lives. But actually, if it was a wrong thing to do, then as a Christian, was I putting that to one side to be pro the COVID vaccine? And as I'm sure Simon's going to go on to sort of talk about in the second half, it's that there've been some people who have been quite helpful in what they have written, and a lot of what I have thought through. Then the chap called John Stevens, who some of you might know as the head of FIEC, wrote a paper about it, which I found very helpful. And then when we did the first big clinic, and the first clinic we did, we vaccinated 1,100 people. They're all these, you know, elderly people over the age of 80, many of whom probably this was their first outing. And statistically, 7 of those lives would have been saved by us vaccinating that number of people. And it makes it very real when you see that number of people coming through, and then you think, actually, those lives have been saved. And as Simon, you know, said, those lives are precious. And so yeah, so I'm still pro, and I'm giving it.
Great, thank you. And just, I mean, you kind of hinted at it. Generally, how have patients responded to getting their jabs?
And obviously, you know, the patients who we're vaccinating are people who've come, so they're obviously very happy. But yeah, people have been really grateful. You know, they're and some of these people I've then seen since, because I've seen them for other reasons in the surgery, and they are just very. It makes them hopeful for, you know, being able to see family, being able to actually live lives, because a lot of people might come out for a medical appointment, but they haven't been out for anything else, and so people are very grateful.
Brilliant. Karen, thanks very much. So until we interviewed Karen just now, nothing that we've said, I think, in the first half should lead us to even query accepting the vaccine. So why ask the question? In some parts of the world, and in evangelicals now in the last couple of months, this has been quite a hotly debated issue. In America, one of the most prominent evangelical Christian pastors, John Piper, has encouraged Christians to turn the vaccine down as a matter of principle. At the same time, another prominent evangelical Christian pastor, Tim Keller, has said that Christians should take the vaccine. So why the question? Well, again, as Karen has said, there is a specific moral question surrounding the most common COVID vaccines. And that's because the testing and production of these vaccines involves the use of cell lines derived from fetal cells. So these are the two involved in the vaccines that are likely to be available in the UK. One is HEC293, and that's a cell line that was made in 1972-3 from human embryonic kidney cells. The transformation was done using an adenovirus. And the origin of the cells is a little unclear, possibly from a spontaneous abortion, but more likely a planned abortion. The second cell line is PER-C6, made in 1985. So I'm just thinking this is actually before most of the people listening this evening were born. But anyway, from the retinal tissue of a planned termination on a baby at 18 weeks gestation. Both of those events, that is the terminations, if they were planned, would be very uncomfortable. That those that happened, we would say they were wrong. Now, just for clarity, COVID vaccine research has not involved the termination of any new pregnancies, but it has made use of these historic cell lines that were generated from terminations. The terminations were not performed to generate the cell lines. That is, they are events that would have happened anyway, but cell lines were produced as a byproduct. There's a slight difference between the vaccines. So either production or testing. So production, again, doesn't mean that the vaccine contains fetal tissue, but where a vaccine is a modified adenovirus, like with the AstraZeneca vaccine, it's been made in a cell culture so that it can replicate. So you need to use a cell line like HEC293. And the AstraZeneca vaccine is grown in this way before the vaccine is then extracted and purified. Now, because cell lines like HEC293 have been used in research for many years, they're well understood, and so they're often used in testing vaccines. So the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine uses the same cell line in its testing, but not in its production. And it's for this reason some Christians will take a view that to take the vaccine is to cooperate with evil. John Piper is one who we've mentioned. Dave Brennan is another. He came and spoke recently at Christchurch on the issue of abortion in a very helpful way. John Piper would argue that the connection with evil is remote, but we are accepting the consequences of an historic evil action. Dave Brennan would be stronger and would argue that the connection to evil is proximal, that is close, because by taking a vaccine, we imply support for current abortions. Now, what I'm going to do now is just touch on a few biblical principles that I hope will help as we consider whether that's a valid line of argument. Karen's already mentioned him. I think probably the most helpful brief article is one written by John Stevens. You can Google it. He currently works for the FIEC, and he interacts in a bit more detail directly with the arguments of John Piper and Dave Brennan, because they're some of the most outspoken advocates of rejecting vaccine use. Some of what I say, if you read John Stevens' article, you'll notice I've borrowed from him. But let's start with Psalm 139. Let me read those verses to you. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. So here's our first principle, and that is human life is precious, even when it's present in the womb, and therefore abortion is wrong. In 2020, the World Health Organization estimates that worldwide there were 73 million abortions, which accounts for over half of global deaths last year. We have to say that if vaccine production made necessary any additional terminations, then a Christian could not accept it, whatever the benefits. Termination of pregnancy is a Christian concern, and we commend Dave Brennan's ministry and his desire. However, I don't agree that to take the vaccine is to commend abortion. The connection with evil is remote, and it's impossible for me to live in this world and not be connected to past evil acts or benefit from them. I'm able to benefit with a clear conscience, providing that I'm not involved in the original act itself, and also providing that the act itself was not deliberately committed to produce my benefit. If I need a kidney transplant, I can accept one from a victim of a drunk driver without participating in the evil of the driver. I cannot go out with the intention of running someone over in the hope that they're a tissue match. There is a significant difference. Let's see how that works out in one example in 1 Corinthians. Again, let me read those verses to you. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Paul is talking to the Corinthian church about sexual immorality within the church. And after he's outlined his thoughts, he says this: I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave this world. But now I am writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or slanderer, a drunkard or swindler. Do not even eat with such people. But what Paul is saying is that if we live in this world, we can't escape association with evil. We ought to avoid it within the church, but in the world, well, we're called to be part of the world, in it, but not of it. That is how Jesus prayed for his disciples. In John 17, he prayed that we will be protected from the evil one whilst in the world. But we cannot help but buy some products made in countries with evil governments. But actually, they're all evil in some measure. It can be a right decision, for example, in history when Christians boycotted sugar in their tea because they were opposed to slavery. But it can't be avoided completely. We pay our taxes, I hope, thankfully, for good government, but we know that some of our tax revenue will be spent to support evil. We benefit from many medical treatments that have morally questionable origins. There were horrific things done to the prisoners in Auschwitz by the Germans during the course of the Second World War. But some of those horrific things led to techniques that are still used today, for example, in open heart surgery. We wouldn't counsel someone to avoid the bypass because of the historic source of the technique. Let's look at Mark's Gospel. Again, I'll read those verses to you. Mark 12, 30 and 31. It comes in the chapter where people come and ask Jesus questions to trap him. Do we pay taxes to Caesar? Do we get married at the resurrection? And then one of the teachers hears Jesus giving a good answer, and he says this: of all the commandments, which is the most important? The most important one, answered Jesus, is this: hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. And this is pretty solid ground to stand on. I should love my neighbor. So when I drive at the speed limit, reducing the risk of causing an accident, I am loving my neighbor. When I wear my face mask, when I go shopping at Asda or other supermarkets, so that I don't transmit infection, I am loving my neighbor. And by receiving the vaccine so that I don't become ill and can continue in useful labour, and so that I don't pass on my infections to others, by doing so, I am loving my neighbour. We have a clear command to love our neighbour. And then just one more verse from the book of Galatians. Galatians 6, verse 10, where Paul says this: therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. Of course, the greatest good I can do is tell someone the gospel. The most loving thing I can ever do is tell someone how to be spared from the coming wrath. But to do good is a broader category than simply to share the good news. I want to invite my friend Aellen to the real life events coming up in May, but I also show my love to him by taking the vaccine and not passing on a disease that could potentially kill him. So I can receive the vaccine and do good, loving my neighbour by helping to stop the onward spread. I can tell someone the good news and do good, loving my neighbour by sharing the gospel with them. And these are not mutually exclusive categories. I can do them both. In fact, if I speak to the nurse whilst receiving the jab, I can even do both at the same time. So hopefully those are some biblical principles to kind of steer me on my way. And so these, I think, are the conclusions that I would draw. The first is that we should mourn with those who mourn. You know, it's easy to kind of blur when the numbers reach into the tens of thousands, but the death of anyone should cause us grief and heartache. If people are valuable to God, we should mourn with those who mourn. I think secondly, we should take the vaccine if we're offered it, understanding that by doing so, we are loving our neighbour and caring for the body that God gave us. And in both of those things, we're on pretty solid biblical foundations. Third conclusion, we give thanks for common grace. And that means the impact of the disease is reduced. But also, we should recognise that Christians live according to conscience on this matter. Vaccines were not around in the first century, and so it's difficult to find a verse to tell us exactly one way or the other which way we should stand. So I've argued in favour, but we shouldn't condemn either those people who with well-informed good conscience decide against vaccination. I think well-informed is significant. We want to have a conversation, but each of us is accountable to God for our own actions. Nor should we condemn those who take up vaccination when offered if we ourselves feel that we shouldn't. And I think it's helpful that we show that we love one another when we allow disagreements on this kind of question. We don't quite see eye to eye, and yet our love for one another is still evident, and this commends the gospel. And then lastly, kind of like a side conclusion, we should try and influence research decisions as much as we can. We want to encourage the use of cell lines in research that don't carry these ethical objections to them. That will mean I'll favour the generation and use of adult stem cell lines. That's a fascinating area of research and a great debate to be had. If we're exercised by the issue of abortion, then rather than have a strong view about vaccines, maybe we should have a view about the thousands of unwanted frozen embryos in the UK. If we are exercised by abortion, and we should be, well, there's currently a government consultation on permitting the taking of the abortion pill at home. That's been permitted during this time of pandemic. The government are proposing to continue that. Well, pray about the issue and fill in the government consultation. So those are my conclusions, such as they are. I'm going to read a couple of verses from the book of Romans as a blessing as we finish. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will.
So my question is on a different side of the ethical issue around the vaccine. So there's been talk that Africa might not see a vaccine to 2023. As a young person who's relatively low risk of having any negative effects for the vaccine, should I be accepting a vaccine when there's doctors in Africa who might not get a vaccine for years to come? How do we think about that?
Bethany, that's an excellent question, and one which I completely avoided this evening because I just thought, because there's so many things you want to ask. I think really as Christians, that's probably a bigger ethical issue than personally whether I ought to take it or not. It's just that's the one that's been the hot topic for Christians recently. I think we need to pray for wisdom for our government, don't we? Because it's easy for the government to say, we're going to jab everybody first. I mean, you could make an argument for saying, really, you should vaccinate everyone in Brazil, South Africa, and the UK first because we've got the worst variants. But that's a good question. I think probably you could I don't know. I think you could with a clear conscience say, no, I'm going to wait I'd rather the government sent it to somewhere else in the world where the need is greater, because really people keep saying, don't we, we're not safe until we're all safe, because spread of the disease in other countries increases the risk of variants that can come back and cause death and difficulty in every nation in the world. So, great question. We should be thinking about it more. When we come to vote on stuff in Parliament, let's write to our MPs and say, why not send 20%, 30%, 50% of our vaccine supply once we've jabbed everyone over 50, or everyone over 50 and all the police, or I don't, these are difficult decisions, but I think it's a better ethical question to be asking. If I'm young and low risk, do I want to be first in the queue? Sorry, I've not given an answer, have I? But excellent point.
Yeah, someone's just messaged, would abstaining actually change whether any get sent to Africa?
Karen's just sent me a helpful little message to say that a consideration for Bethany is thinking that if I turn down my vaccine in the UK, I'm still increasing the risk for older people, because I can then be an asymptomatic carrier of so there is an argument that's not selfish by which you would take it.
Just a question about speaking a bit more into future research and production of medicines and the difference ethically there. When the immoral act has been historic, how much difference it should make to our thinking of future medical research?
I think it's a bigger. So one thing at the moment is that there are lots of embryonic cells produced in the UK through IVF, and although this isn't, I expect, a Christian approach, lots of people would be stack them high, sell them cheap. I want to have as many as possible because then I've got a chance of having one baby. And one of the defences given for that kind of approach is, well, of course, we can always use the spare cells for scientific research. And I think that's ethically unacceptable for Christians. So, I mean, we do have a regulatory body in the UK, the Human Embryology and Fertilisation Authority. And these things come up for debate in Parliament. And so we should be aware of those things as they're going on and be involved in lobbying and writing to try and address some of these issues. I think one of the good things in biology is that the issues are kind of moving on, in that in the last 10 years, since the induced pluripotent stem cells and so on, the use of embryonic stem cells in research and in treatment has kind of receded from the list of sensible possibilities. And actually, adult cell lines and look like they're actually going to be far more useful in terms of research and treatment, and for which we should be thankful, but also encouraging their use, because they just don't come with the same ethical objections and potentially far more powerful in treatment. So I think other people could probably talk more eloquently about adult stem cells. But yeah, as things come up, we should be writing and praying for Christians involved in research that they'll make wise decisions.
I guess my question's kind of following on, thinking what's the difference ethically between receiving the vaccine and developing the vaccine?
I think currently, it's a different question, isn't it? But I think for Christian involved in biological research, to use a cell line that's established is a different ethical question from establishing a new one. And so I think for a Christian, they would probably have a clear conscience in using some of these historic cell lines in research, but wouldn't be willing to be involved in the generation of new embryonic stem cell lines, even as a byproduct of an event that was already happening.
Yeah, I guess it can be quite concerning to see. Obviously, it was really helpful how you said that it's an issue of conscience, kind of our response to the vaccine, and not to condemn other Christians who've come to different conclusions. Yeah, I guess it can be really concerning to see Christians saying not to take the vaccine or vaccines generally, and that the effect that has on other people, and yeah, many people who maybe in America kind of yeah, now not going to take the vaccine. Do you think that we should be kind of talking to our Christian brothers and sisters who yeah, trying to persuade them in some ways, even if we're not condemning them, but lovingly kind of sharing our concerns, yeah, about kind of the effect it has on other people, and loving our neighbour in this way?
Yeah, absolutely. I hope that's something that we all do all the time, is talk to one another and talk through decisions and encourage each other to think biblically, to get information, to think things through, to make decisions. And, you know, on a whole range of questions, each individual is accountable to God for the decisions that they make. You know, when Paul talks to the Corinthians, each one examine themselves before they come to the Lord's Supper. And so on lots of things, I think that is an individual's business, but we should talk and pray. Now, if you want to make an ethical decision that you're going to go out, have 25 flaming Zambucas and sleep with 20 men in the next week, and then murder your parents and drive a bus off the cliff, that's I don't mind being extremely direct with you on such ethical decisions. But on things that are a bit more nuanced, where, you know, biblically thinking Christians can come to different decisions, I want to give liberty for you to make those decisions. I'm sure that you wouldn't do any of those terrible things, Lydia, so that's okay. But yeah, so I think, yes, do talk, do weigh up the facts, do think about the biblical principles. But if the Bible isn't direct, we need to leave space for people to have act on their conscience before God. So I think, I mean, my last point was to say, you know, if people have made a well-informed decision, then that is okay. If they're making a not very well-informed decision and I can help to inform them, then I think that's good too.
You mentioned adult cell lines, Simon. Where do adult cell lines come from?
Oh, what a great biology question. So obviously we all begin as one cell, and that one cell has got the potential to become all cell types in the body. And that capacity to become all cell types is present in the early embryo, up to like just a little bit past the blastocyst stage, which, you know, in the first few weeks of pregnancy, lots of cells have got that capacity to become any tissue type. And that's why historically people have been very interested in embryonic cell research. But you have in your body now stem cells that are going to divide and become several cell types. So in your bone marrow, you have cells that can become all the different sorts of white blood cell and red blood cells, for example. And in your skin, you have cells that will keep on dividing all through your life and can become a small range of cell types. But actually, the more recent research has been done on taking those adult cells, which don't have the ethical objections of destruction of embryos, and retraining them to then become any cell type in the body. I mean, historically the use has been to treat leukemia with bone marrow transplants, but potentially you could do lots of different things. Very famous paper published in 2010 by a Japanese guy called Takahashi on induced pluripotent stem cells. He won the Nobel Prize, but I'm getting a lot of blank faces, so I'll stop saying. But you potentially could be the source of stem cells that could be used to treat your own disease, and then there's no problem with things like immune rejection and so on. So I think most biologists would say adult stem cells are potentially a more powerful treatment pathway and research pathway. So we want to say thumbs up to that.
it sounds like the scientists aren't 100% sure that the vaccine actually does stop transmission. So is it actually the case that us taking the vaccine is loving our neighbour? Because actually, for many of us, we wouldn't get severe disease. So, does that loving our neighbour argument really work?
So yeah, good question. So I mean, Orlando mentioned something this morning, didn't he, where scientists say unknown because they haven't looked at that question. So almost all of the vaccine trials have been looking at the question, does having the vaccine stop you becoming ill and having to go to hospital and then maybe die? And so when they give efficacy rates, that's the question that they've been asking. Now, even if you never had onward transmission, like not going to hospital and being ill is a way of loving your neighbour, because that means if they need to go to hospital, then they're not going to have to sit in an ambulance for 2 hours before they get admitted. So the question of whether it stops onward transmission is not one that scientists are like, oh, well, we don't really know. We don't really care. It's just one that hasn't been specifically looked at in more detail. There was news out today looking at that question in particular, and it looks like it probably does. The Oxford AstraZeneca trials have been giving PCR tests to everyone in the trial every week. And so they have got reasonably good data that says it does stop onward transmission. So the vaccines were designed to stop people dying, but it's likely that they also stop onward transmission. So not being a clog up on the NHS, you're loving your neighbour that way. And probably, if you have the AstraZeneca vaccine, and almost certainly the other ones as well, you are reducing onward transmission. But the data for that is not yet in, because that's not the question that people were asking when they set up most of their vaccine trials, if that makes sense.
So my second question was, so I was chatting with a friend about taking the vaccine, and they said that they would only accept the vaccine if it was, I think, the one that had the higher efficacy rate, because they want to have the better vaccine. What's your comment on that? If we've got friends in that situation who say they might not take one because they want the better one, how as Christians should we respond to that? And how, if any of us are thinking of that ourselves, that actually we'd reject one because we'd want maybe a different vaccine because we think it's better, how should we respond as Christians kind of to that conversation?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I mean, one is that you won't get a choice when you show up. It's not like you go to the restaurant, don't you? You look down, am I going to have the chicken or the burger or that's not how it works. You'll be invited to make a vaccine appointment, and you won't necessarily know which one you're going to get until you show up on the day. In Southampton, one side of the river has been having one and the other has been having the other, and in some vaccine centres they don't know which they're going to get until the day. But I would also say that vaccine efficacy above 50% is what they look for, and all of the ones that have been passed for use are well above that. So in terms of preventing your own infection and not passing it on, I would just say take whichever one you're offered, and don't delay. But yeah, but also it's a slightly false situation because you won't get a choice. It's not like the red one or the pink one. You'll just get one.